Assalamualaikum students, this video is for November 2023 paper 2-3 question 5 part B. The question reads, a country has a persistent deficit on the current account of its balance of payment. Assess the likely consequences for the domestic and external economy of this country. As you know by now that there are 8 marks for knowledge and understanding and there are 4 marks for evaluation. So for this question we need to show the understanding of what is a persistent current account deficit, and we need to analyze domestic consequences of this persistent deficit as well as the external consequences. So 8 marks for the analysis and 4 for the valuation. So a persistent deficit on current account arises when the outflows for imports. When we talk about imports, we talk about both imports of goods as well as services. Incomes sent abroad and transfers made exceed the inflows for exports incomes earned and transfers received. Now this definition is not complete, but let me tell you a couple of things about these lines which I've written so far. So if you look at, we use the word imports and we use the word exports. Now these are the two sections of current account. Exports and imports of goods are recorded in the balance of trade, whereas exports and imports of services are recorded in the invisible section of current account. So both are sections of current account. The third section is primary income, which records the income sent abroad and incomes received or earned from abroad. So this is the primary section of current account, third section of current account. And the fourth section is transfers made and transfers received. Now this is the fourth section, and transfers are those payments which we do not earn but we receive them, like pensions, like donations and aids. So these are the four sections of current account, and a deficit means that the combined outflow of all these four sections are more than the combined inflows for all these four sections. Now there is a word persistent as well. Unless we mention or talk about the word persistent, we cannot get the full marks for knowledge and understanding. So a persistent deficit is one which occurs on more continuous basis for a longer period of time, for more years in a row. So a persistent deficit in a current account when outflows exceed imports for a longer number of years, for a high number of years in a row or continuously. So this is persistent current account deficit. We now move on and discuss the consequences of a current account deficit for the domestic economy. Domestic consequences. Remember, do not give headings when you write an essay in paper 2 or paper 4, but I am giving headings for your better understanding. So domestic consequences of a current account deficit. A deficit on current account usually means a trade account deficit. That is, exports fall short of, and of course, exports of goods. Exports fall short of imports of goods. Net exports are net exports become negative. AD falls. Since net exports are a part of AD, and when they become negative, AD falls. It withdraws demand for locally made goods. It leads to lower GDP, and since domestic firms produce less output because of demand withdrawal, they hire fewer workers as well, leads to lower GDP and lower employment. As shown in the diagram below. Though diagrams are not needed, we can still make them for a clearer and better understanding. So diagram, make sure you label the diagram accurately. So this is a macro diagram. So along x-axis we write real GDP, along y-axis we write price level. Writing price won't be enough, and writing quantity along x-axis won't be enough. It must be clearly an AD curve, downward sloping, and upward rising AS curve. You must show the initial equilibrium points, P naught, initial income, Y naught. Please do not label macro diagrams with word quantity, Q. Now, since there is a deficit on current account, and it means there is a deficit on trade balance, usually it means that way. It is not essential, but that's the topic of another video, that will a deficit on trade always lead to a deficit on current account? So answer of that will be discussed in some other video, but over here briefly let me tell you that a current account deficit usually means a deficit on trade. So that means net exports are negative, and that means AD shifts to the left, and we show it through an arrow, and we also label both AD curves clearly in a different manner, and the price level goes down and the real GDP goes down. And since labor demand is a derived demand, when we make lesser output, we hire fewer workers, and these are the two consequences of domestic economy. We have studied that when net exports become negative, AD falls, and that leads to lower GDP, lower economic growth, and lower employment. Another domestic consequence is that local producers will be discouraged. As there is a culture of importing goods, there is less demand for domestically made goods. Local producers will be discouraged. Manufacturing units will begin to close down, whereas businesses involved in the trading of imports may thrive. So, manufacturing capacity, which is already low, and because of that there is a trade deficit, this will further decrease because domestic production and domestic investment in manufacturing sectors will be discouraged as people are buying more and more imports. The government tax revenues may also fall due to low economic activity within the country. People are importing and not buying goods made locally. There is less business activity, there is less production activity, there is less commercial activity in the country, there is less employment, and government tax revenues will fall. Now, these are the domestic consequences. Now, we may talk about a positive consequence as well, but since it's a persistent deficit, there is hardly a positive consequence. For a temporary deficit, like an occasional deficit, we may say a deficit may bring some positives. For example, if the deficit is because of the import of raw material, it is because of the import of machinery, it may help. The deficit of a year may lead to a surplus of future year. But what is happening in this case? It's a persistent deficit, deficit after deficit. So there aren't any positive consequences. Otherwise, whenever there is a question about consequences, please do mention both positive and negative. But in this case, I'm avoiding mentioning positive consequences as it is a persistent deficit, and country has been suffering from this deficit for many years, and it doesn't indicate in any way that they have been importing raw materials or machineries to increase their exportable surplus. That has not been happening, and it seems to be the case of Pakistan's economy, which has been facing this chronic deficit on current account, and that has been one of the major reasons of our economic problems. We now move to discuss the external consequences. External consequences of a persistent deficit. The reserves of foreign currencies will deplete rapidly. Now, reserves of foreign currencies may work for a year or two or three, but if you keep having persistent deficit, they cannot help you for many years. Now, Pakistan's foreign reserves currently are at around $8 billion. This video is being recorded in the beginning of March 2024. So, the reserves are just around $8 billion. And if we have a deficit which is expected to be around $6-7 billion, which is quite less compared to what we had a couple of years ago, but still there is a deficit of $6-7 billion, the reserves cannot help to bridge that gap. So what we need to do then? The reserves of foreign currencies will deplete rapidly, forcing the government to borrow. And it's not just the borrowing, it is borrowing that is borrowing done externally. We cannot print US dollars. We can print rupees. If we have a deficit in our budget, we may overcome it by printing more notes. But when we have a deficit on current account, we need more dollars, and we need to borrow them then. If we don't have our own dollars, we need to borrow them. And that is the reason that Pakistan's external loans are exceeding $130 billion now. And in next 2.5 years, actually less than 2.5 years, March, April, May, June, 4 months and 2 year period, we have to pay $75 billion to our lenders. It's a staggering amount for a country like Pakistan, whose economy, real GDP per annum is around $350 billion. For us, this is a huge payment. And this is one of the major worries of our economic advisors. So reserves of foreign currencies will deplete, rapidly forcing the government to borrow extensively. This will put unaffordable pressure to repay loans on coming generations. On future generations would be a better word. Now, what has since 1947, we have been having current account deficit in most of our history, and that has led to the accumulation of this huge debt, and that is putting a pressure on us. And if we do not rectify things now, it will be keep on adding more and more pressure on the future generations. This will also put a downward pressure on exchange rate. This will also put a downward pressure on exchange rate. As we have seen in Pakistan, our exchange rate has depreciated by more than 50% in the last couple of years. It is because of the persistent deficit. Now, what happens when the exchange rate becomes weak? The weaker currency triggers both demand pull and cost push inflation. So when the currency becomes weak, it causes both demand pull and cost push inflation. And that is being happening in Pakistan. One of the main reasons of high inflation in Pakistan is this weaker currency. And when we actually borrow more money from external sources, they put a lot of conditions on us. And of course, there could be IMF package which may ask us to raise the price of electricity, gas, etc. That may also contribute to rising inflation. Another domestic consequence, another external consequence would be that the attempt, the attempt to reduce. Actually, this is a domestic consequence. I will give the heading. The attempt to reduce imports may slow down economic activity in the country. So this is a part of, so we may write it is one of the domestic consequences of persistent deficit. So whenever in Pakistan now we had a huge deficit, we tried to reduce it. We put bans on imports and raw materials imported. The imports of raw materials went down. The import of necessary machinery went down. It became difficult for businesses to open the letter of credit, LC we call it, and that slowed down the economic activity. This is a domestic consequence. I have written it over here in the section of external consequences. So after we have done with both domestic and external consequences, we move to the last stage of our essay, and that is evaluation. In evaluation, we need to tell which consequence is more big, or more serious, and more worrying for the economy. These consequences are linked. Are closely linked. If there is a fall in exchange rate, this is an external consequence. It leads to inflation. That is a domestic consequence. Similarly, if government decides to cut imports, the domestic economic activity gets slower. Because when businesses are unable to import raw materials, they cannot produce goods in enough quantity, and businesses shut down and workers are laid off. So this is a domestic consequence. And that may lead to reduced production and reduced exports, further leading to higher deficit. Now there is an external consequence. So just look at this, that how an external consequence is leading to an internal consequence, and how an external consequence is leading to internal consequence. So this is closely linked. These consequences, we cannot really separate them. So in conclusion, we can say a deficit, we should write the word persistent here, because a deficit alone may not be worrying, but a persistent deficit is worrying, as it indicates a serious threat to macroeconomic stability of a country. Now this is a very important line. Now what is happening in Pakistan today? We are facing a lot of economic problems. We are experiencing inflation, we are experiencing unemployment, we are experiencing low demand, recession. Every economic problem is here. Why? Because we have been having persistent deficit. And when we keep having persistent deficit, a time is going to come when things are going to collapse. A deficit means borrowing. A borrowing cannot be sustainable. A persistent deficit is worrying. It is not sustainable. Since it is not sustainable to have a persistent deficit. You may have an occasional deficit. I've been saying it again and again. We have a deficit because we are importing machinery. No problem. Next year, we'll install the machinery. Next year, we'll start exporting more. And next year, our exports and import will become balanced. So maybe 2-3 year deficit, but then surplus. But a persistent deficit is not sustainable. You cannot sustain by continue to borrow and borrow and borrow. So since it's not sustainable to have a persistent deficit, the country must immediately revert to make necessary adjustments. The sooner they do it, better it will be for the country. However, you may write one line that if the deficit is falling as a percentage of GDP, then it may be less worrying and less challenging. Please note that this question is about persistent deficit. If the question was about a deficit only, I probably may have talked about some positive consequences as well. But a persistent deficit is very hard to define. A persistent deficit may be less of a worry if it is reducing as a percentage of GDP. Remember, the absolute number of deficit matters, but more important thing is what is the percentage of that deficit to your national income. Person X, his income is 100,000 rupees a month. His loan is 1 million. His loan is 10 times of his monthly income. Another person, his loan is 100 million. Lot more loans, but his income is also very high. And we have to compare X and Y by not only by the amount of money they borrowed, but also we need to compare the percentage of their loan to their monthly income, and that will actually tell us that who should be more concerned about his loan, X or Y. So percentage of loan to his income is more crucial number. So a persistent deficit may be less of a worry if it is reducing as a percentage of GDP, as it gives greater resources. It gives greater resources to the government to make necessary adjustments. When a deficit is falling as a percentage of GDP, means we have more GDP left after taking care of the deficit, and we can spend that money on making needed reforms in the economy. But the country whose persistent deficit is rising as a percentage of GDP, they may be in a greater problem because they have less resources to make those necessary reforms such as training and education, reform in areas where the country has comparative advantage, like Pakistan, that we can raise our exports of agriculture sector by enhancing farmers' productivity, or we can raise IT exports by educating our young boys and girls, and we can also encourage emigration of skilled labor by giving skills, basic qualifications and basic education to our workers who do these manual works, and they'll be able to earn more and send greater amount of remittances. So these reforms require resources, and country which has a higher GDP and a person proportionately lesser deficit may be in a better position to make these reforms. Thank you very much. I hope you like this video.